Welcome to Lunch with the Lord. I'm Pastor Mark, and we are starting a brand new book of the Bible. It's the Gospel of Mark. And this lesson, we're going to be doing an introduction to the Gospel of Mark. And then next lesson, we're going to be starting chapter 1 and verse 1. But before we begin, our theme verse for Lunch with the Lord, Jeremiah 15:16. Thy words were found, and I did eat them, and thy word was unto me the joy and the rejoicing of my heart. Now, as we begin this introduction to the Gospel of Mark, because the Gospel of Mark is an historical account of Jesus's life and times, and because it is filled with places and stories and events, then my approach to teaching this gospel will be both to not only study important words as they appear in the text, but also to study the gospel in segments, such as parables and times or feasts or other events in Jesus's life. So as we study, we're going to be breaking this gospel down, not only verse by verse, word by word, but also we'll be studying topics. Now, I've been studying the Gospel of Mark now for a number of weeks, and I'm really blessed on what I'm learning. I'm sure that I've many years ago, I would say, guessing maybe 25 years ago, I did a brief study of the gospel, and I went through the Gospel of Mark. And you may ask, well, why are you doing the Gospel of Mark? Because I did it 25 years ago, and I thoroughly enjoyed it then. And now I have a lot of notes on the Gospel of Mark. And it's easier for me to do the Gospel of Mark than to start Matthew or Luke or John. And but as we study the Gospel of Mark, we are also going to be going into Matthew and Luke mainly because they are considered the synoptic Gospels. And a lot of things that you see in the Gospel of Mark, healings or miracles that Jesus did, are also seen in Matthew and in Luke. So as we study the Gospel of Mark, we will also be looking at the Gospel of Matthew and of Luke also. So because they also have somewhat the same, maybe the same healing of the leper as in that's in Mark is also in Matthew and maybe Luke, and they have a different view. So we'll be studying, in a sense, kind of all three of these Gospels as we go through this Gospel of Mark. Now, let's look at Mark as the author of this book. And this is the same as John Mark that we see in Acts chapter 12 and verse 12. So Mark here is the same person as John Mark in Acts 12:12. And as we see in this same verse, his mother's name is Mary. And it seems that their house was used as a place of prayer, and also that as a place of a meeting place for Christians to gather for fellowship. Now, we see in Colossians chapter 4 and verse 10 that Mark is related to Barnabas. Now, in Acts chapter 13 and verse 5, Mark went with Paul and Barnabas on their first missionary journey. But then, for whatever reason, Mark decided to turn back and to return to Jerusalem in Acts chapter 13 and verse 13. Then in Acts chapter 15, verses 36 through 41, Paul refuses to take Mark on the second missionary journey, and Mark was the reason why Paul and Barnabas split up. Barnabas came back from the first missionary journey. He caught up with John Mark and encouraged John Mark to go on the second missionary journey. When Paul found out about it, he was upset, and Paul and Barnabas argued about John Mark, and because of that, Paul and Barnabas split up, and Paul took Silas, and and Barnabas took John Mark, and both of them, they sailed to Cyprus. Now, about 12 years later, John Mark is seen in Rome during Paul's first missionary, his first imprisonment, in Colossians chapter 4 and verse 10. And we see also in Philemon verses 23 and 24. Mark also spent time with Peter in Babylon in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 13. And finally, we see that Paul requests to have Timothy bring John Mark with him to Rome to be a help to Paul in his last days before being executed in 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 11. So this is the history of John Mark as we see him in the Word of God. He departs from Paul and Barnabas, but Barnabas comes back and encourages him and builds him up. And through Barnabas's ministry, John Mark is made a useful tool in God's hand. And finally, at the end of Paul's life, when he's getting ready to be executed, he requests Timothy to have John Mark, bring John Mark with you when you come, because he's profitable to me for the ministry. And Paul recognizes this, that John Mark has been restored and he is serving God and he can be useful to Paul while he's in prison. Now, the date and the place that the Gospel of Mark was written. Now, the date, scholars have this gospel written between 50 and 70 AD. And some scholars actually narrow it down to between 65 and 70 AD. Now, the fact that John Mark mentions the future destruction of Jerusalem, but he does not mention it as being fulfilled, points to a date prior to 70 AD. So, we know that Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD. John Mark in his gospel here writes concerning the future destruction of Jerusalem. But he does not write it as if it was a past fact. Therefore, the date of this letter being written has to be before 70 AD. Now, the place that it was written is believed by most scholars to have been written in Rome. And after Paul's death, after Paul was executed, it is possible that John Mark stayed in Rome and wrote this gospel. In 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 13, Peter calls Mark his son. Now, he was not his biological son, but his son in the faith. And we know that Mark spent time with Peter in Babylon. And it is believed that this gospel is better seen as the gospel of Peter. though Mark did not spend time with Jesus himself, the years that he did spend with Peter and hearing Peter preach and hearing Peter's testimonies, John Mark was able to compile facts and also piece together all the information to write this gospel. Now, as we finish this introduction, let's look at some comparisons between the gospels. You may ask, why are there 4 gospels telling basically the same stories about Jesus' life? Why couldn't there be just one gospel? And the answer is that each gospel has its own specific purpose. And I remember when God touched my heart back in 1975, in the springtime of 1975, and I began to read the Word of God. I had such a hunger to read the Bible, so I decided I'm going to start at Matthew, and I'm going to read all through the New Testament. And then when I'm done, go back to Matthew and read the New Testament again. And I read the New Testament probably 2, 3, 4 times through in just a couple of months. I would come home from school. I was my last year of high school, and I would come home from school and I'd lock myself in my bedroom and I'd open up the Bible and I'd read 6 chapters of the New Testament every day right after school. Come home and I'd read 6 chapters. And I did that for several months. And I was able to read through the New Testament a couple of times. And the thing that always that I questioned was why, how come, Mark and Luke say the same things as the Gospel of Matthew, as Matthew did? Why are there 3 stories about a leper being healed, right? Or why are there 3 stories about the the feeding of the 5,000, or 2 stories or whatever? I mean, I would read Matthew and then I'd start the Gospel of Mark, and it's like, well, Matthew just said the same thing. Why is Mark saying it, right? And then after I get through the Gospel of Mark, then I go into Luke and I'd start reading Luke. Well, no, Matthew and Mark, they had their own version. Why does there have to be 3 of them? And I would think about, why would God want to repeat the same thing 3 times? And what's the purpose of this? Well, there's differences. The issue is that the answer is that they were written for a specific purpose. Each gospel has its own specific purpose. So the first one is that how does each gospel portray Jesus Christ? How does each gospel portray Jesus Christ? And the Gospel of Matthew portrays Jesus as a king. Jesus Christ is king. The Gospel of Mark portrays Jesus as a servant. The Gospel of Luke portrays Jesus as being the perfect man. And finally, the Gospel of John, he portrays Jesus as the mighty God. Now, the second issue is this: what does each writer emphasize? The Gospel of Matthew emphasizes Jesus' sermons. The Gospel of Mark emphasizes Jesus' miracles. The Gospel of Luke emphasizes Jesus' parables. And finally, the Gospel of John emphasizes Jesus' doctrines. And the last issue of differences in these Gospels is, what culture were they written for? What culture were these Gospels written for? Now, the Gospel of Matthew was written to the Jews, and the Gospel of Mark was written to the Romans. The Gospel of Luke was written for the Greeks. And finally, The Gospel of John, well, his gospel is written for the world. It's written for all cultures, every nation. So as we see, each gospel was written for a specific people to present the story of Christ's life. And in so doing, they're giving a fuller account of Jesus's life. So this is what sometimes you'll see, where you'll see the same miracle or the same thing that Jesus was doing in Matthew is also in Mark and in Luke. But each one has their own viewpoint. Each one has their own view concerning their own how they saw this miracle or how they saw this teaching that Jesus gave. And it gives a fuller view. But each gospel is written specifically for a people group, to reach out, to reach the gospel to this culture, to this people. All right. So we're going to start chapter 1 and verse 1 next lesson. But until then, walk with the Lord. I know he walks with you.